Hey everybody, this video is called Touch Not Thine Anointed, and many of you probably have heard that phrase before. If you're just like me, you've been on the receiving end of that stick, especially if you are into apologetics or if you call out false teachers and false doctrines and all that. But tonight we're continuing our pass-through in the book of 1 Samuel, looking at the 24th chapter, where we're going to look at David sparing Saul's life. And so 1 Samuel chapter 24 verse 1 and 2 says, "Now it happened when Saul had returned from following the Philistines, that it was told him, saying, Take note, David is in the wilderness of En-gedi. Then Saul took 3,000 chosen men from all Israel and went to seek David and his men on the rocks of the wild goats." So in the previous chapter where we left off on Wednesday, God miraculously delivered David by drawing Saul away to fight the Philistines at the moment. And Saul was ready to capture David and to have a field day with him. But when Saul was done with the Philistines, he went back to pursuing David. And the 3,000 chosen men were the most skilled soldiers that could be offered. And the rock of the wild goats was an unknown cave location, although wild goats stresses the inaccessibility of the cave. And I don't like the word goats, if you know me, but that's a whole story for another day. In the En-gedi canon, it runs westward from the Dead Sea, and some describe En-gedi as a tropical paradise rather than being a geographical location of being in the middle of a desert. And in verse 3 it says, "So he came to the sheepfolds by the road, where there was a cave, and Saul went in to attend to his needs. David and his men were staying in the recesses of the cave." And in verse 3, it's a very interesting when you look at went in to attend his needs. The Bible is being very appropriate in talking about, of saying that he's having a bowel movement as the person would crouch with his inner garment dropped to his feet. And attend to his needs, it means to cover his feet. And what are the chances, out of all the road trips, Saul had to attend to his personal need at the very moment that he's passing the very cave where David hid? Why would God have this happen? And some might try to argue that it was by coincidence, but I don't believe this is happening by coincidence. It was predestined by God to test David, to train him, and to allow him to display his godly heart. And I believe, this is a divine appointment, is the word I like to use here. And verse 4 through 7 says, "Then the men of David said to him, This is the day of which the Lord said to you, Behold, I will deliver your enemy into your hand, that you may do to him as it seems good to you. And David arose and secretly cut off a corner of Saul's robe. Now it happened afterward that David's heart troubled him because he had cut Saul's robe. And he said to his men, The Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, to stretch out my hand against him, seeing he is the anointed of the Lord. So David restrained his servants with these words, and did not allow them to rise against Saul. And Saul got up from the cave and went on his way." And so David's men perhaps believed that God had providentially placed Saul in the same cave where they were hiding so that David could kill the king. And it kind of, does make sense that maybe this predestined moment taking place is God is going to allow this evil man to be taken out. But we're going to see coming up that vengeance is of the Lord. And nothing revelatory had previously been said by the Lord that indicated that he wanted David to lift his hand against Saul. And yes, God has used mankind, certain men, in his choosing to bring judgment on other men. But this is not the case of being God's will. And we see that David was able to cut off a piece of Saul's robe undetected. And however, touching Saul's clothing was equivalent to touching his person. And David's conscience troubled him on this account, per se. And David recognized that the Lord himself had placed David into the kingship. And therefore the judgment and the removal of Saul had to be left to the Lord. And that reminds me of in the New Testament where we are supposed to know that God appoints world leaders in their spots. In Daniel chapter 2, verse 20-21, we see that God sets up nations and he takes them down. God puts kings in their places. And David was determined to let God be God and to get Saul out of the way, not to take justice into his own hand. And Saul made his life miserable. There is no denying that. We know that David had to hide and run for a good period of time. But David did not store up bitterness and anger towards Saul. He said, you know, Lord, you are in control. You are the one that needs to deal with this guy. And if he stored up the bitterness and anger towards Saul, he would not have been able to resist the temptation to kill Saul under the pressure that his men are giving him. And, you know, it seemed like a risk-free opportunity that David has here. And David only cut off a corner of Saul's robe, but yet we see that his heart was troubled, as the robe was a symbol of Saul's royal authority, and that he had done anything against Saul's appointed authority. And David not only kept himself from taking vengeance upon Saul, we see that he restrains his own servants from doing such a thing. And many of us would say, you know, it's okay if someone else does it because I'm not guilty. I'm not the one that physically did it. You know, what can I do? I can't stop somebody else from their actions. But David did not do that. We see that he restrained his servants. He told them to back off. And these are the words of a humble leader with tender conscience before God that we see through David. And when David's servants saw his godliness and how he wanted to please God and everything, their hearts were restrained from doing evil against Saul. And in verse 8, it says, David also arose afterward, went out of the cave, and called out to Saul, saying, My lord the king. And when Saul looked behind him, David stooped with his face to the earth and bowed down. And so we see that David takes what we might consider a crazy move. He surrenders himself to Saul because he saw the opportunity to show Saul that his heart was toward him and to reconcile. And we see a great submission to Saul here. And David respects the position of the leadership of the king. And we can have our own thoughts on it. We can think that David was an idiot for doing what he does, but David goes on to show great trust in God because he made himself completely vulnerable to Saul. And Saul could have easily killed him right at that moment that David is bound before his feet. But God is sovereign, and God is going to protect David to fulfill his promises. Because if any man can thwart the will of God, then we're in trouble. And in verse 9 through 15 says, And David said to Saul, Why do you listen to the words of men who say, Indeed, David seeks your harm? Look, this day your eyes have seen the Lord has delivered you today into my hand in the cave. And someone urged me to kill you, but my eyes spared you. And I said, I will not stretch out my hand against my Lord, for he is the Lord's anointed. Moreover, my father, see the corner of your robe in my hand, for that in that I cut off the corner of your robe, and did not kill you. Know and see that there is neither evil nor rebellion in my hand, and that I have not sinned against you. Yet you hunt my life to take it. Let the Lord judge between you and me, and let the Lord avenge me on you. But my hand shall not be against you. As the proverb of the ancients say, wickedness proceeds from the wicked, but my hand shall not be against you. After whom has the king of Israel come out? Whom do you pursue? A dead dog, a flea? Therefore let the Lord be judge, and judge between you and me, and see and plead my case, and deliver me out of your hand. And David, he showed the kindness and the tact of Saul. And David knew very well that Saul's fear of David came from Saul himself and not anyone else. And the principle of not striking the Lord's anointed leader is good and it's important. But we see, sadly, that it is often abused today. And we're going to hit on that more in the wrap-up. And if David were a wicked rebel against Saul's rule, as Saul claimed back in chapter 22, verse 8 and 13, he would have killed Saul. This was a great appointed time, a great opportunity time where he could have killed Saul if that was really his intent. But the corner of the robe was proof to Saul that David was not his enemy. And David called for the Lord himself. And, the Lord is the only true, fair, and impartial judge, as Judges 11:27 states. But we see that David calls on the Lord to decide the fate of them. And, I always like to think of God as the only fair and impartial judge, because mankind in the role of a judge is going to let you down. There's too many trials that I've watched where I believe that the judge was either targeting the defendant, more severely than what should have happened, or in the other case, the judge shows too much leniency on the guilty party. And a proverb is given by David, given a traditional pithy statement that evil deeds are perpetrated only by evil men. And a similar point is made later in the gospel according to Matthew, which we'll look at what Jesus says later. And David, he expresses his lowliness and entire committal of his cause to God, who is alone the judge, and to whom alone belongs vengeance. And back in chapter 15, verse 27-28, Samuel rebuked Saul for his disobedience to God hard-heartedly. And in his distress, Saul tried to keep Samuel from leaving, and we see that he grabs his robe, and a portion of the prophet's robe tears away. And when Saul is left holding the torn piece of Samuel's robe, Samuel tells him that God is going to take away the kingdom of Israel from him and giving it to his neighbor, who we know is going to be David. And now we see that David is confronting Saul with the torn robe. And, Saul must be reminded of the incident on why he's being chastised. And God's message to him was very loud and clear. It could not be mistaken. And it was unavoidable, as Saul would be judged and that he would lose the throne. And David trusted in God to deliver him instead of trusting himself. In verse 16 through 19 says, So it was when David had finished speaking these words to Saul that Saul said, Is this your voice, my son David? And Saul lifted up his voice and wept. And then he said to David, You are more righteous than I, for you have rewarded me with good, whereas I have rewarded you with evil. And you have shown this day how you have dwelt well with me. For when the Lord delivered me into your hand, you did not kill me. For if a man finds his enemy, will he let him get away safely? Therefore, may the Lord reward you with good for what you have done to me this day. And so Saul, he responded emotionally because Saul lived on the delusion that David was truly out to get him. And we see that David proves that that is untrue. And David's obedience to God and his love for Saul made a difference in softening Saul's heart. And upon hearing David's testimony, Saul acknowledges that David was more righteous than he was. And his testimony to David's righteousness recognized David's right to the kingship. And wrap up the chapter, verse 20 through 22 says, "And now I know indeed that you shall surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel shall be established in your hand. Therefore swear now to me by the Lord that you will not cut off my descendants after me, and that you will not destroy my name from my father's house." So David swore to Saul, and Saul went home, but David and his men went up to the stronghold. So Saul clearly acknowledges that David would be the ruler over the kingdom of Israel. However, Jonathan also testified to Saul back in chapter 23, verse 17, that David would be king. And Saul wasn't ready to give up the kingdom, and by solemn oath, David agrees to preserve Saul's family and family's name. And while most of Saul's family was later slain, as we're going to look at in our next study, Lord willing, in 2 Samuel 21, verse 8 and 9, will be in December, this pledge was though fulfilled in the life of Mephibosheth. And so, to do a wrap-up, we look at Saul seeking David in the wilderness, and Gadi, the wilderness in Gadi. And we saw that Saul unknowingly came to the cave where David and his men were hiding. And, he was taking care of some personal business when on his trip, he ends up in the same location. And we see the encounter upon with Saul that David goes on to restrain not only himself, but he restrains his own servants from killing Saul. And sometimes we can find ourselves, when we have a promise from God, we can think that we are justified in sinning to pursue that promise. But that is not so, folks. And don't be mistaken, that is always wrong to try to take matters into our own hands. And God will fulfill his promises in his way, his place, and his time of choosing righteously. And we need to be like Abraham, who obeyed God even when it seemed to be at the expense of God's promise, willing to sacrifice his son of promise in Genesis 22. Now I want to go over to Luke chapter 4, verse 5 through 8. Luke 4, verse 5 through 8 says, "Then the devil, taking him up on the high mountain, showed him all the kingdoms of the world in the moment of time. And the devil said to him, All this authority I give you in their glory, for this has been delivered to me, and I give it to whomever I wish. Therefore it shall, if you worship me before me, all will be yours. And Jesus answered and said to him, Get behind me, Satan, for it is written, You shall worship the Lord your God, and him only you shall serve." So we see that we need to be like Jesus, where Jesus did not take Satan's offer to win back the world at the expense of obedience. And, whenever we are standing on a promise of God, we must be walking in obedience to receive that promise. And, it is always to be at God's place and time of choosing. And we see that David revealed his presence to Saul. And we saw that David's speech to Saul. We saw how David lives out Proverbs chapter 10, verse 12, which we'll also look at 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 8. And it says, "And above all things, have fervent love for one another, for love will cover a multitude of sins. And Peter, he shows us that love is powerful and it can de-escalate tensions. And in verse 13, Jesus later made the point that evil deeds are perpetrated by evil men. But showing love to others can actually de-escalate situations. And showing care and compassion can de-escalate matters before they escalate worse. And the reason why we have so many issues that go out of hand among us is because we are not walking in the greatest commandments to love the Lord our God with all our heart, our soul, and mind, and to love our neighbor as thyself. And I want to go over to Matthew chapter 7, verse 16 and verse 20. So Matthew chapter 7, verse 16 says, "You will know them by their fruits. Do men gather grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles?" And then in verse 20, Jesus said, "Therefore, by their fruits you will know them." And so, like I said, Jesus made the same point as David, that evil deeds are perpetrated by evil men. And Jesus says, you can identify people by their actions in Matthew chapter 7. And we see the point of touching not thine anointed of the Lord. And have you ever been on the receiving end of that stick of someone telling you, touch not thine anointed? Don't you speak out against that televangelist or that preacher. Don't touch thine anointed. And if you call out false teacher or wolves, you will most likely hear it rather than not if you were doing it right. And it's a popular abused phrase that is among us today. And the charismatics of those who don't rightly divide God's word, they take that phrase, which comes from only in the book of Psalm and in this passage today in 1 Samuel. And they say, that you should never speak against a pastor or church leader, touch not thine anointed, or the Lord's going to strike you with bolts of lightning and fire and all that. And what they are really teaching is that it's okay to be above our criticism or rebuke so that you keep your mouth shut if you are not a pastor. You got to believe everything the pastor says and all that. And that's where you end up in coats. And sometimes, outside of protecting their favorite itching ears, teachers and preachers, it's also used to prevent a biblical evaluation or teaching. And David in context recognized that the Lord's anointed, and in context, it's a physical harm that David's not touching him. David has some pretty harsh words to say to Saul, and we've witnessed it before. We're going to witness it still in the upcoming days. But, David not touching thine anointed was a physical harm. He was not going to kill Saul. And he humbly confronted Saul with his sin, and hoping that Saul would have a change of heart, that Saul would come to repentance. And it's entirely wrong for you or anybody to entertain the idea of touch not thine anointed, the Lord's anointed, to protect a leader from all evaluation or accountability. And we see that Saul honored David's mercy toward him. And we saw that Saul looked into the future. And, I know I mentioned charismatics in the video. I just want to clarify, I have seen that phrase used within independent Baptists even in the past, and that might be a little surprising. I've seen church members saying, how can this person be so harsh to the pastor, not touch thine anointed, but it seems to be more in the charismatic circle of that phrase being abused among us. But we're going to wrap up the video here because it is the weekend, and we'll see you next as we're going to be looking at David with Nabal and Abigail. So I hope you have a great rest of your weekend. God bless. See you this upcoming week.